The Internet History Podcast is brought to you by MetaLab. Their slogan is MetaLab, we make interfaces. For a decade, MetaLab has helped some of the world's top companies and entrepreneurs build products that millions of people use every day. You probably didn't realize it at the time, but the odds are you've used an app that they've helped design or build. Apps like Slack, Coinbase, Facebook Messenger, Oculus, Lonely Planet, and many more. MetaLab wants to bring their unique design philosophy to your project. Let them take your brainstorm and turn it into the next billion-dollar app, from idea sketched on the back of a napkin to a final shipped product. Check them out at metalab.co. That's metalab.co. Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. One of the best tech books I've read in a very long time is Bored, Lonely, Angry, Stupid: Changing Feelings About Technology from the Telegraph to Twitter. Look, we do history on this show, right? And if you know history, you know that every technological innovation freaks people out. Is it rotting our brains? Is it making society worse? Is it making us, well, bored, lonely, angry, stupid? But with the modern internet, with mobile, with social, is it different this time? I spoke to the authors of the book, Luke Fernandez and Susan J, and the answer is very interesting, I think. They actually took the time to look back historically about how society has reacted to technological change and how technological change has shaped society and how we think of ourselves. So please enjoy this conversation and please buy the book, Bored, Lonely, Angry, Stupid. I'm going to start, forgive me, with maybe the most cliche question imaginable, which is, what was the inspiration to write this book? But the reason that I ask that is because this is kind of something that I wrestle with all the time, which is that, it's like, I think everybody knows, like, with every advance of technology, people clutch their pearls and worry about what it's doing to us. Is it warping our brains? Is it destroying the social fabric? That sort of thing. But then, like, what if this time it is different? Is kind of what I wrestle with, like, in the way that a stopped clock, is right twice a day. What if the sky is falling scenario actually comes to pass? Do you need to acknowledge that? I'm wondering, to what degree were you guys poking at something similar?
Yeah, that it reminds me of an interesting story. What was the New Yorker columnist who said something similar? That the Romans consoled themselves that the barbarians were at the gates many, many times. You never need to worry. And then all of a sudden, there weren't any Roman baths for 1,500 years or whatever. So just because it hasn't happened, just because it's been a progressive, there's been progress in the past, doesn't mean that we shouldn't always be worrying about what's going to happen next.
And we also, when we were doing our research, we were wondering at first, is this just the same story that other generations wrestled with when,
right, exactly,
or the telephone? And ultimately, we decided each of these technologies had their own particular effects. And it's not just the same story over again, but each story is a little bit different.
Right. And, let's go into that now. Like, you capture so many of those previous panics about technology so well. I mean, that's the rhyming is beautiful. And of course, technology history is sort of what this show revels in. But like, just picking randomly, like, we can start with selfies. Like, when you guys describe when photography first came out, it was all about, like, a professional studio, and you went and preserved your appearance almost for posterity. That's kind of why people, like, didn't smile in old photographs, aside from the fact that you had to stand perfectly still for about a minute, also because of the aperture and things like that. But then Kodak comes along, and people have access to photography regularly, and then suddenly people are worried about the things that they're worried about now: narcissism, vanity, egoism, all that good stuff.
Right.
I mean, yeah, you can call the photography sort of that there were Victorian selfies. I mean, when you look at people going into studios in the 1860s, there certainly were instances of people engaging a lot of affectation. You know, there were the sort of the classic account that we often talk about is when women would go into the studio. You know, back then people didn't like to reveal a lot of skin, but part of the skin that was revealed was your ankles, and so people put a lot of premium on having slender ankles. If you didn't have slender ankles, then you had cause to be worried. But what the photographer would invite you to do was to keep your ankles back if you're a woman, and then give you some fake ankles that would appear under the hem of the dress. And that worked all just fine as long as you remember to keep your regular ankles back. If you put them forward, then of course the photograph had, you know, 4 ankles instead of 2. So there are plenty of accounts of affectation and people engaging in vanity, and so you can read the history as sort of a precursor to the present, or that is rhyming with the present. But
well, and they even had you know, you could hire people to help you put a better face on your photograph, or like give you tips for that sort of thing, or even the idea of smiling. Well, and this is stepping forward a bit, but like. When you know, Kodak comes along and everyone has cameras, then it's this notion. The notion changes where it's about being cheerful and presenting an image of yourself to the world. That's already there. Like even again, like this idea of Instagram people like only presenting their best selves and being influencers and things like that. That's already there even in photography in the early 20th century.
Right. It's definitely on the uptick by the early 20th century. We see in the 19th century, it's a bit more mixed. I mean, people are beginning to experiment with all these poses, you know, posing with props and having beautiful ankles, even if they're fake ones. But they're still hearing from their ministers, you know, don't be vain, don't promote yourself, don't worry about how you look too much. Remember, you're going to die soon. It's all futile. By the early 20th century, those warnings are heard less and less, and the imperative to look your best is something even ministers will celebrate and say that pride in oneself is a good thing. And then not only are you supposed to have pride in yourself, you're supposed to have pride in your family and your house and your vacation. And you're right, the Kodak camera definitely begins to educate people on how to present themselves with their own camera as having a perfect and enviable life.
I'm going to run down a couple other of these because I love the rhyming. Like this is one that had never occurred to me when we talk about the digital divide today. Like going back to letter writing, there was like a postal divide because, you know, letter writing is this great noble pursuit that we think of today as like erudite, and like if only we could go back to the times when people took the time to write a letter and put it in the mail. But it was largely for rich people at the beginning, the literate people, the educated people. And then even then, people were worrying about things like, are you narcissistic? Are you just sharing the mundane details of your life? It's almost like, again, clutching pearls about sharing and blogging about what you had for lunch today and things like that.
Yeah, and you can call it rhyming, but I think what we're really trying to say here is that it really took these technologies of the 19th century, the mirror, the photograph, the postal service, or letter writing, to accustom Americans to the idea or the virtue of self-expression and taking pride in oneself, because the older moralists were counseling that, you know, that pride and vanity were sins and that you shouldn't indulge them. But of course, these new technologies, when they emerged, were certainly encouraging that type of behavior, and it forced Americans to sort of reconsider their attitudes towards the messages of the older moralists. So yeah, I mean, from the present, we look back and we see these as, you know, we look at the photography of the age and call it the Victorian selfie, and it looks like the same thing, and it is to some extent, but of course, it's really a benchmark of sort of an evolved evolving American psyche, an American psyche that once was very skeptical of pride and vanity and self-esteem, and the emergence of a new American self that indulges more in narcissism and is much more receptive to the virtue of self-expression. And of course, the term narcissism, right? We can say that people were narcissistic in the 1850s, but that's an anachronism because people never used that word back then. It only emerges.
You know what? I want to come back to that in a second because a lot of this book is almost looking at the history of these ideas of ourselves and our societies and how they've evolved over time. A couple more real quick. The idea that people are too distracted, that they can't concentrate, that attention spans are shrinking. I feel like that's one of those things that has always been trotted out, like with everything from TV to even magazines, because it's like a digest to music videos to video games, all that stuff. That's kind of always felt like a straw man argument to me, like the weakest thing that you can trot out with every new technology, that like you can't focus, it's distracting, that sort of thing. I'm curious how you ended up coming down about that.
Well, that was actually where we started, or what gave us the impetus to start the book. Luke applied for a grant to study distraction in the classroom and got the grant, and that led to us teaching a class on how people have responded to distraction in the past and present. So that was really the genesis of the whole project. What we ended up finding was that our obsession with being able to focus today is a fairly modern obsession. People in the 19th century began to feel increased pressure to concentrate as their world got more complex. And that began to occur in the late 19th century. Before that, people were more content being generalists, and you could see that in higher education, where people didn't have things like majors, right? You could just kind of learn stuff. You didn't have to have a focused, narrow body of attention, body of knowledge to attend to. And then all these pressures, as the world becomes more complex, there's this idea that you have to focus more and more. What people in the 19th century are worried about, particularly doctors and some educators, is that all this focus may not be good for people. It may not be natural to people. And they began to fear that our brains were finite and there was only so much attention we could take in, and that you might overwhelm your brain and wear yourself out if you tried to absorb all the information coming over the telegraph, being carried by the Transcontinental Railroad, coming in on the telephone. So whereas today we kind of think our brains can do anything and absorb anything and multitask, that was certainly not a 19th century belief.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that reading this made me think about too, is that it's almost like the tyranny of like self-help, self-improvement. Like are as a society, are we a little too nervous about ourselves, like too angsty always? Are we too lonely? Are we too bored? Are we too distracted? It's like bored, lonely, distracted, angry. Like it's always a bogeyman maybe of our own invention, and then the new kind of always rises up to be the scapegoat for us. I mean, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but like that's kind of what I kept coming back to when I was reading the whole history of all these things.
Yeah, I mean, the underlying motivation of the book was when we were reading, we were all familiar probably with that famous article by Nicholas Carr in Atlantic called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And there's so many other articles like it, worrying about how the modern psyche is being changed by the internet. And so we were interested in going back, another century or two to see whether the anxieties in the past were the same. And of course, there's stuff in the past that reminds us of our present day anxieties. But what we're also saying is that the anxieties have changed over time as well. So when Susan was saying that, yes, of course, even William Wordsworth, I think, said, that the world is too much with us, his famous poem to that effect. So people were worrying about information overload, from the beginning of the industrial age. But our anxieties do shift subtly over time, and that's really what we're trying to sort of trace in this book.
Yeah, and a large part of the book is that it's as much as the book is a history of the various technologies and how they plug into society and how they either shape society or vice versa. One of the things you do very well is chart the historical record of these concepts, like concepts of loneliness, concepts of boredom. If you're, as you describe, if you're a pioneer out on the, wherever, out on the plains, and you're in a log cabin or whatever, like concepts of boredom or any of these things were different and have changed over time, especially for Americans. And some of them that we're grappling with are modern. Like these are not things that people wrestled with back in the day.
Yeah, that's very true. Boredom's a great example. It only really came into being as a word in the 1850s. Up before that, people didn't love having dull, monotonous, or tedious times, as they called them, but they weren't surprised for them. It wasn't a whole feeling state unto itself. And it's sort of by the creation of that category that we know that there's a mental shift going on, right? That people are beginning to think, this is an issue, and maybe I should look for ways to solve it. And maybe it shows that the tolerance for monotony is going away. What we find is that while people expect monotony in the 19th century, by the 20th century, they're kind of coming to expect that diversion, variety, entertainment are their due, that human nature requires constant stimulation. And certainly our own age and our own technologies of the 21st century play upon this perceived need to keep us constantly engaged with online games or new apps. So what 19th century people expected out of life and what we expect out of life is somewhat different.
Let me come back again to two more of the major themes that you poke at in the chapters, especially. I was really fascinated by your questioning as to whether or not, or to what degree, technology has taken awe and wonder out of modern life. What made you start to poke at that?
Yeah, well, and to that concern, there's some clever psychologists have called the concern ADD, and by that they don't mean attention deficit disorder, but awe deficit disorder. That perhaps we're not capable of experiencing awe as much as our forefathers. That chapter really complements our chapter on narcissism. One doesn't usually think of awe and narcissism together, right? But awe has been sometimes conceived like the awe that our forefathers, that Jefferson had when he looked at sort of the landscapes of his own day, of nature, provoked a sense of humility in him when he contemplated.
Right, exactly. Awe is the idea that there's something bigger than me, greater than me. I'm tiny in the face of this larger thing.
Right. And so if you don't have much awe in your life, then perhaps those moments in which you can experience that sort of humility vis-a-vis the greatness of the universe are diminished. So as narcissism goes up, and if awe is going down, those sort of narratives complement each other. And another reason why has perhaps awe gone down? I mean, it's partly speculative, but it's much harder to see the Milky Way than it once was. In China, with all the pollution, it's even hard to see the sunrise. I mean, I was looking at they're even putting up screens that'll sort of simulate a sunrise in public squares in China to try to sort of simulate that sort of awe. So when you don't have those sort of encounters with nature, then perhaps you won't have as much humility as you once had. We do say that, awe, the awe of nature sort of transforms itself towards awe of technology. So we are still experiencing awe today, but that kind of awe perhaps is different than the kind of awe that we have towards nature, right? If you have awe towards technology, you can sort of take pride in the power of humanity. It might be a little less humbling than the type of awe that we experience when we're contemplating God or nature.
Well, I wonder, actually, Susan, that what Luke just said it made me think of, like, there's that. We remember, our first going on the internet and connecting with communities that we couldn't get locally, or the first time you had a smartphone, you're like, I can do this with a phone. Like, there's a sense of awe there. I wonder to what degree. Well, actually, there's two things. I wonder to what degree, like, that's when we think about, like, oh, technology is not as exciting as it once was. Like, if that awe has gone away for a lot of people, or to what degree, like, that sort of, like, technology makes things simple. The fact that you don't have to walk out on the street and wonder where a cab is. It's like you order the cab first. Like, how much making everything simple takes away that awe. And that's what technology is supposed to do, right?
So some people we spoke to when we interviewed them talked about feeling almost entitled to the new technologies of their day. They were so accustomed to getting the latest updates, the newest iPhone with enhanced powers, that it became kind of an expectation, and part of what they believed it was to be a human was to constantly have the new and more powerful device in your hands. That stands in pretty marked contrast to people who are contemplating new technologies, whether it's the telegraph or the railroad or even things like the lightning rod. People were amazed by these devices, and often they appreciated them, but often they were also fearful of them and wondered if they should even have these powers that seemed like the possession of divinity, that God controlled lightning and he used it to strike down people he thought were sinners. So should you really have a lightning rod on your house? God controls electricity. Should you really be able to appropriate it to, send a banal message halfway across the continent? There were questions about were we as human beings entitled to these powers, or were we becoming like Prometheus? You don't see that much skepticism after the late 19th, early 20th century. More and more people incorporate the powers of technology as part of what it means to be human. And we had folks we interviewed who told us that they think the smartphone is now part of the definition of humanness. So our sense of our own powers has grown, and our sense that these powers belong to forces outside of ourselves has definitely diminished. One other thing that led us to write the awe chapter was that when we were reading about these 19th century inventions, it was so clear that that people felt a sense of wonder. And when we did interviews across the country, we'd ask people, do you feel awed by your phone? Do you feel like it's an amazing thing? And sometimes people would say, indeed, they did. But a lot of times people would kind of giggle, particularly when they heard that folks were awed by the telegraph, which to them was this antique, weird thing they didn't even understand. Like, how could you be awed by that? So just kind of the difference in emotional register made us think there might be a big and important transformation there.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is not original to us. The scholar David Nye wrote a book called The Technological Sublime, and he's argued that the half-life of awe, he doesn't use the term awe, but effectively it's awe, has declined with every sort of with the acceleration of innovation. So people were awed by the train, from its inception up until pretty much the beginning of the 20th century. But nowadays, the half-life of awe is much shorter, a much shorter time span.
Coming back to one more thing, going down the list of things that you're investigating or interrogating, I feel like this is super, super relevant, and we don't have to necessarily get political about it, but the idea of modern media and modern technology making us more angry, riling us up. What did you find about that?
Well, that was certainly a big question that emerged more and more over the course of writing this book. At first, we didn't even think a chapter on anger would be that interesting. And as we got farther along in the writing process, it became clear that it was something we needed to deal with because so many people were talking about anger. It's clear that other technologies in the past allowed people to communicate anger, newspapers, the radio, but there were a lot more restrictions too. Generally in the 19th century, the people who were most empowered to be angry were white men, and there were real social costs and sometimes physical perils people faced if they were women, if they were African American enslaved people trying to express anger, if they were emancipated slaves after Reconstruction, free people expressing anger. The racial line was fixed, and people who were not white males were really kind of prohibited from being angry. And so one thing we think online media has done is that it's offered a new forum for people from all backgrounds to express emotions that once were only the province of white men. So in that way, there's been a bit of a democratizing force with these technologies, and some people have used social media platforms to fight for social justice. Other times we see a lot of trolling going on, so it kind of depends what purpose it's put to.
But what about just the putting it simply, the raising of the temperature? Like how like again, this is one of those things where I feel like I feel like this is settled historical consensus that when radio came around, demagogues and populists and whatever seized on this new media and made their message, achieve, as Silicon Valley would say, scale that they couldn't have achieved before. I'm wondering how you guys came down on the idea of that, of like, maybe it's not just anger, maybe it's just the raising of the temperature, like the increasing fervency and things like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's an angle on it anyway. I mean, the transition from the awe chapter is, that perhaps if we can sort of recover awe or if we can just remember that there's still a lot of awe towards technology, and that can act as a social glue, then perhaps we can sort of become a more harmonious society. And the problem is, of course, is that awe is not evenly. I think I'm stealing a term from I'm forgetting the tech guru who said this first, right? With regard to
not evenly distributed. Yes.
Yeah. Right. Who is that?
I can't remember. I think it's a science fiction writer or somebody like that. The future is not evenly distributed. Yes.
Yeah, and so awe is not evenly distributed either, right? And so when it's not evenly distributed, the power of awe isn't really going to temper incivility as much as it could were it more evenly distributed. And so the sort of the sanguine and sort of positive and optimism that we have sort of in the awe chapter, we sort of backpedal a bit on that in the anger chapter, because we wrote the book for almost for the last decade, and so things changed pretty radically. I think you've used this term as well, right? The worm has turned. Well,
and I've said that when I started working on my book, it was like, oh, you're going to explain to me how the internet happened, and then 2 or 3 years ago, it was like, oh, you're going to explain how the internet ruined our lives. Like that I feel like actually your book is almost more of the moment, because it's like trying to figure out like. Is the worm turned? Are things getting rotten? And to what degree has it always been thus? Or like, is this just always what happens when new technology comes?
Yeah, and I think, we would argue that certainly the internet didn't invent anger, but it's given it freer license for good and for ill. And, some of the people we interviewed kind of recognized intuitively, even if they weren't coders themselves, that there's something in those algorithms that, drives more business to angry tweets, right? That there seemed to be a way that anger was used to maximize traffic and advertising opportunities and redirect people to other sites. And while they couldn't explain the back end of it, they could observe it themselves. And so definitely there's a feeling that anger is being manipulated and monetized today, at least in some of its forms online, which may be polarizing us more.
Yeah, and it was the last chapter we wrote, and as Susan said, we turned in the manuscript, and our editor came back to us a couple of months later, and we thought we were done. He said, "Hey, you need to write a chapter on anger," and of course, this was all post 2016. It's no accident, perhaps, that we were writing that chapter. It was the last chapter we wrote, and it is an opportunity there to sort of reflect back on. Where have these technologies taken us? Are they really being distributed in ways that benefit everyone in society? So yeah, it's anger is important, and when we had to include it at the behest of our editor, but also just because it's important of itself, given what's happened.
No, 100%, 100%. Well, so as you've been mentioning, a good portion of this book is devoted to interviews with contemporary people of all walks of life, talking about these issues, even on a personal level, right? And what struck me was how much it feels like we're all still groping around in the dark about this stuff. Just like we almost still don't have the language to describe our feelings and experiences about this stuff. So I've had this thought before too. Like we're still so in the moment that like we don't even know whatever transformation, whether it is profound or whatever our society is going through. It's hard for us to grok it and like describe it when you're in it. What did you think about the experiences of posing these sorts of questions to normal, everyday people and how it actually, impacts their lives?
One thing we noticed was that people were extremely eager to talk. And we were talking between ourselves every day about it. So after a while, it was like, well, of course, these are issues we should be thinking about. And it seemed like people on their own, in their own heads, had been posing some of these questions to themselves, but hadn't had
wrestling with it.
Yeah, but welcomed the opportunity to talk it out and think about what was happening. And we both had this experience teaching classes too, where our students didn't realize you could think about these issues systematically, or in another way than just on their own. In terms of their own personal, Instagram feed or something. And so one thing we found was this great eagerness and enthusiasm to discuss it.
Yeah, after we give presentations, people come up afterwards, and you expect them to be asked pointed questions or challenging questions, but oftentimes it's just them wanting to come up and talk about their own feelings about technology, and you sort of feel more like you're a therapist, and not even offering sort of self-help remedies, but just in a willing ear to help them work through the issues for themselves. And so, in that sense, even if we don't have any clear answers to any of their questions, at least we offer them a forum in which they can voice their concerns.
And we found, of course, it depended on who we interviewed. We interviewed some people who worked at Pixar, and we interviewed college students, and we interviewed 87-year-olds, and you'd find this, obviously a whole range of responses and differing analytical frameworks for understanding what was going on. But the commonality was that these were, we ideally thought, well, we'll interview people for 45 minutes or an hour, and sometimes these would be 3 or 4 hour conversations, because that's how much people want to talk.
Final question is, you guys quote at some point Andrew Bosworth's Facebook's now infamous quote that I harped on last year a lot, where he says, like, the ugly truth is that we believe in connecting people so deeply that anything that allows us to connect more people is often de facto good. And again, this comes to something that I'm wrestling with all the time, which is, like, I always thought that, like, giving everyone a soapbox, giving everyone a voice is de facto good. Connecting people around the world is de facto good. To some degree, I agree with Andrew, even though I don't agree with him on a lot of things. But implicit in all of tech, and this is a totally separate, like, economic question about, like, well, more engagement, more usage because it helps their bottom line, they can sell more ads and blah, 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 blah. I'm wondering if maybe we're coming out of this sort of maximalism period. I'm sorry, I'm rambling, and this is a long question. But, like, I interviewed on the Internet History Podcast Justin Hall, who a lot of people credit as being the first blogger. And he went through this period of, like, sharing everything, and then he completely withdrew from the internet, and then he came back to the internet once he learned how he could live with it and not ruin his life through it. And so I'm wondering, as a society, and again, I'm just a dilettante historian, I'm not an academic, but I wonder, in the historical sense, how much you think that these are growing pains. These are all of us learning as a society how to deal with these new changes. And if the next generation, 5-10 years from now, they'll look back on us and they're like, oh, you got duped by that crazy guy on the radio or TV or whatever. Well, you didn't know. You were too naive about the media and that sort of thing. How do you think, to what degree do you think that these are things that will solve themselves as society just moves forward?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, your book, How the Internet Happened, is a great, great read. And so I would not call yourself a dilettante.
I appreciate it.
Everyone should pick up a copy and read it if they want to learn about how the Internet happened. But to your question, part of the answer is, I think, and we can say this about Silicon Valley, is that they're Kevin Kelly, his book, What Technology Wants. It's sort of the emblematic sort of manifesto of sort of technological determinism, that technology is an inherently good and progressive force in society. And for many years, that's how we were sort of describing the internet, that it was an inherently democratic force, that Twitter would catalyze the Arab Spring. Yeah. And so that all we needed to do was sort of ride the wave of innovation, and that would take us into a bright utopian future. And of course, when the worm turned in 2015 or 2016, we've had an opportunity to reconsider that sort of ideology, that religion, the idea that sort of technology will determine our destiny in a positive way, and that we were sort of realizing that we've got to take the reins, and that it's important for us to play a role in our own destiny, and that we can't just count on technology taking us there of its own accord.
And we think, both that if on the one hand emotions change over time, we can collectively think about what kind of emotional culture we want our technologies to foster. And obviously technologies are changeable, and maybe we should, and this is definitely more Luke's purview than mine, but definitely we should think about what kind of technologies we want to design, and realize that they have emotional and social implications.
Yeah, have a little bit of forethinking going into what we're designing and things like that, as opposed to just random throw it against the wall and see what sticks. Listen, this book is fantastic. Again, it's Bored, Lonely, Angry, Stupid, Changing Feelings About Technology from the Telegraph to Twitter. And I think that this is a perfect example of why tech history is valuable, because it is almost like, well, it's not fighting against Luddism or, like, people worried about what technology is doing to us. It's putting it in a context to try to understand, like we said at the very beginning, is it different this time, or is it the same old song that we've heard over and over again? And, like, that's so important to our society as we go forward. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you like what you've heard on this episode, please support us by subscribing to the podcast so you can get great news stories and conversations every 2 weeks. And please buy the book that was based on this podcast, How the Internet Happened, From Netscape to the iPhone, by me, Brian McCullough. Order it now wherever books are sold. How the Internet Happened. And if you weren't aware, I host a daily tech news podcast every weekday that comes out at 5 p.m. In that show, I tell you what happened that day in the world of tech. It's only 15 to 20 minutes long, and it's great if you love tech news. Search your podcast app for Ride Home to find the show. It's called the Tech Meme Ride Home. Thanks.